Well-heeled aristocrats, gilded halls, manicured gardens, the court of Versailles is remembered for its opulence. But behind the grandeur, the reality of French court hygiene was far dirtier and smellier than most people imagine. In this video, we'll uncover the true standards of cleanliness at Versailles and reveal what life was really like for those who lived there. In 1682, King Louis XIV of France permanently moved his royal court to Versailles. Though Versailles had originally been a hunting lodge, Louis expanded and remodeled it so that it became a glittering palace, worthy of his status as the Sun King. French aristocrats were expected to live there as well. Etiquette and manners were highly regulated at the palace. But though Versailles was gorgeous to look at, living there was another story. Aristocrats at Versailles kept as clean as they could, based on the practices, knowledge, and assumptions of the era. But the reality of hygiene was far from what we would consider acceptable today. For instance, folks in the 17th century didn't see hot water baths as a pleasurable indulgence or hygienic necessity. In fact, many of them believed that bathing in hot water was bad for one's health. The Sun King was no exception. Historians believe he only had 2 baths over the course of his entire life. Even though people might not have had a weekly bath, it does not mean they were filthy. By their own standards, they were rather clean. When getting out of bed, washing one's hands and face was standard, and a quick wash of the rest of the body followed in the form of rubbing. Some used a wet cloth for this. Some preferred to be rubbed down with perfumes. Others used what was considered to be the safest, alcohol. Louis XIV in particular was rubbed down with cloths soaked in alcohol every day. This quick wash in the mornings was actually considered to be enough because what was thought to keep a person clean was not necessarily washing in water. It was linen. Undergarments and bed sheets were made of linen, and it was thought that this fabric would absorb dirt and smells. Thus, changing the sheets daily was a must, just as changing one's undergarments. Louis XIV changed his linen shirt several times a day, and so did most of the noblemen. It was not only to stay clean, but also to show off one's wealth. The more often a man would change his shirt, and the whiter those shirts were, the richer and more attractive he was. While the linen of the undergarments, chemises, and shirts could be boiled and washed relatively easily, the fabrics that were worn above the undergarments could not be cleaned so easily. Depending on the rank and wealth of the courtier, they would either have a lot or just very few outfits to choose from. While a high-ranking lady had a vast choice of outfits, a lesser-ranking lady would only have a handful, which she would alter with different kinds of shawls, lace, brooches, or pearls. But despite their efforts to stay clean with fresh linen, the real challenge of hygiene at Versailles was the lack of proper sanitation. One cause of bad smells were the cesspools. In their rooms, the courtiers had chamber pots, which they used for their daily business. The members of the royal family had a bit more comfort. Their apartments included a small room, sometimes used to store linen or candles, where a sort of toilet chair was placed. These chairs had a hole on the seat under which the chamber pot could be placed on the floor or fastened to the chair. While today this sort of business is done in private, the courtiers of Versailles were not that worried about their privacy in that department. Some received visitors while on the loo, or placed themselves on it while in company. Louis XIV's closest family was allowed to enter his cabinet des affaires, and Versailles had about 274 of these toilet chairs during his reign. To clean oneself up after the business was done, small pieces of cloth were used. Louis XIV had 2 servants charged with cleaning his pot and handing him the cloth. Doing the business was not the problem. Getting rid of it was. Due to limited plumbing, chamber pots were unceremoniously dumped out windows. Passers-by would have to move with caution. Even Marie Antoinette was said to have been hit by flying waste. If the pots weren't dumped out the window, they would have to be transported to one of the nearby cesspools that collected waste. Given the lack of adequate plumbing and the density of people at the palace, many courtiers answered nature's call whenever and wherever it was most convenient. Seeing someone in the act of relieving him or herself wasn't an uncommon sight. The Princess d'Harcourt, for one, didn't think twice about urinating in public. In 1702, German-born Princess Elizabeth Charlotte recoiled at the behavior she saw at the French court. The people stationed in the galleries in front of our room piss in all the corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartments without seeing somebody pissing. Louis XIV finally made a point of directing servants to clean up the waste weekly, but it couldn't solve the problem. So what did courtiers do to counteract the stomach-churning smells that filled the air? They doused themselves with perfume. As historian Alain Cobin put it, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. Perfumes did not necessarily make things better. The already foul air mingled with the scents of different perfumes, some quite terrible smelling by themselves, and created an odor that was hard to endure. To fight this, courtiers carried little richly embroidered bags with them that were filled with well-smelling herbs or flower petals. Vases with potpourri were placed in the apartments and public rooms, and their scents varied depending on the seasons. Another standard of cleanliness was having good teeth, which were also considered attractive. To keep them in good shape, the 17th century courtier had different kinds of powders which were rubbed onto the teeth. These powders could consist of basically everything, from crushed and dried herbs to powdered sage or even ash. The courtiers also had different kinds of mouthwashes at their disposal, some consisting of vinegar or wine, others honey, and all sorts of sweet things. To rub those powders on the teeth, the fingers could be used or small wooden devices wrapped in linen. All of it was, of course, not half as effective as the toothbrushes and toothpaste we have today. And again, some were more fussy with it than others. After a lifetime of dental problems, Louis XIV was toothless by the time he passed in 1715. His dental woes weren't unique. Most of the French court had a problem with their teeth. Today we know that sweet things are not really good for the teeth. Back then, they did not know that. Sugar was something only the rich could afford, and to show off that they could afford it, it was added to most dishes and even to the powders that were supposed to keep the teeth clean. Another common way to counteract the bad hygiene problem was the use of wigs. Popularized by Louis XIV to conceal his thinning hair, wigs became a symbol of wealth and status, but had their own share of problems. Lice often infested them instead of a person's scalp. Boiling a lice-covered wig was an easier way to control an infestation than picking the lice out of hair. Though men shaved their heads in order to wear wigs and control lice, women, by and large, did not. The hygienic conditions at Versailles also impacted food. The plumbing problems, for example, made life difficult for the palace's cooks. On at least one occasion, sewage seeped into Marie Antoinette's private kitchens and poisoned everything. Though hand-washing was part of Louis XIV's dining ritual, there is evidence that food was not always prepared or handled properly. As a result, intestinal parasites lived within courtiers at Versailles. Even the king wasn't spared. He had several bouts of tapeworm. During one bout, Louis XIV is said to have relieved himself of a worm that was nearly 6 inches long. Even though a courtier could do everything in their power to stay clean, with baths, being rubbed down, and cleaning their teeth, they could still smell awful, due to the fact that Versailles was never an obvious location for a royal court. Initially built as a hunting lodge, it wasn't near flowing water, which could whisk away waste. Worse, the site was built on what one observer called shifting sand and marsh. So when Louis XIV decided to move his court there, the already poor hygienic situation at Versailles quickly deteriorated as more people descended on the space. By staying put at Versailles rather than circulating between multiple palaces, as kings had previously done, Louis XIV put an impossible housekeeping burden on the army of servants and caretakers who simply couldn't keep up with the mountains of filth and waste that courtiers produced. So what did Versailles smell like? Like all the things above, plus stale water. Stale water from the many fountains and reservoirs, as well as from the emptying of tubs and basins on the small courtyards. All in all, not too pleasant. Did any of these strange hygiene practices surprise you? Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating history facts.